Vladimir Putin was very confident that his army would be able to capture the whole four regions of Ukraine until the end of this year, according to Bloomberg sources close to Kremlin. From your perspective, how successful is the Russian army right now in achieving this Putin's objective?
Yes, I think most of us, let's go back to the start of the war. It was pretty clear that President Putin expected Ukraine to roll over, that he would be in Kyiv in a matter of days. You remember the 40-mile convoy of Russian forces, but it was due to Ukraine's great courage, tenacity, bravery, and loss of life sacrifice that actually they withheld Russia and actually pushed them back. Now, Russia's now had a much smaller ambition now down to create that land bridge down from Russia down to Crimea, as you said, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson. And it's pretty clear that's the priority for Russia at the moment. Now, Russia is the bigger army, it is the better equipped, it has got its economy on a war footing, it has access to far more troops, and yet, this summer, Russia has not been able to push its boundaries forward. It's not been able to take those regions, and that must be very much a source of frustration for Russia. A lot of that appears to be down to drones. I'm struck that I study a little bit of military history, and in World War I, World War II, most of the casualties were formed by artillery shells, well over 80%. In this conflict, over 80% of the casualties are now formed by drones, and there are big buffer zones now between the front lines, which are no-go areas, largely because of the effectiveness of those drones. And that's something which Ukraine has ramped up production, and despite its relatively small size, has managed to withstand a lot of Russia's efforts to take its territory.
You just mentioned about Putin's war effort, because Russian army has not yet achieved the main goal of capturing these four regions of Ukraine. However, when could Vladimir Putin realize that this objective is not pretty realistic right now?
I think if you look back at the war, I think President Putin would have expected to achieve these objectives in days or weeks, not years. And I suspect it's a source of frustration for him that he's not been able to move faster. And I think one of the reasons that Ukraine cities have come under attack by long-range missiles, we spoke earlier that there's been some attacks overnight, and one of your colleagues was involved. And I do think some of that is just frustration. Bombing into Kyiv is not going to change the course of the war for Russia, but Russia is not pushing forward. And I do think the fact that President Trump, who holds the key here, let's be clear, if President Trump wants to stop the war, he can do it. And President Putin will be worried now, what's going to happen in 8, 9, 10 days' time? Because if these sanctions, potentially, if you put 100% sanctions on any country that deals with Russia's oil, that will make life incredibly difficult for Russia. It's vital to fund its wartime economy, and that would halt it very quickly. Now, you'd still see Russia pushing for the rest of this year, but almost certainly that would force Russia into a position where it would have to sue for peace. The challenge, of course, and I'm interested when I next visit Ukraine, is Ukraine looks unlikely at the moment to push Russia out from the occupied territories. What is a position that Ukraine will be happy with to end this war?
Also, let's cover this deep battle inside Russia. Recently, I had the opportunity to speak with prominent former US Air Force officials, for example, with retired US Air Force Lieutenant General David Deptula. He is confident that this strategy to strike deep inside Russia with long-range drones to destroy Russia's strategic bombers is a key to forcing Putin to halt the war, to forcing Putin to sit at the negotiating table. Is he right? And do you agree that this strategy on inflicting more pain on Russia, also on regarding disruption, causing this destruction to the civilian air aviation operations. Could this strategy work with Vladimir Putin and force him to negotiate an appropriate peace deal?
Well, Daniel, I've got a great deal of respect for David Deptuda. I think he's a very experienced, very clever individual. I wouldn't say he's wrong. I just think that there are a number of ways to ratchet up pressure on President Putin. If you're looking for a decisive blow, I don't think that's going to provide it. But what you don't know is how many times you have to do attacks before the dam bursts, before there are a lot of people in Russia today who have lost loved ones, lost fathers, lost sons, lost husbands, and it won't have been lost on them with over 1 million casualties now. You can't hide that. And I suspect that Russia is getting increasingly worried, and there will be more and more moves against President Putin. Now, will that happen in the next day, week, month, maybe even year? I think it's unlikely, but anything that you can do to ramp up pressure, I think is a good thing. The challenge, I think, though, is that this is all about the front line. It's all about how far Russia can get. And frankly, when you and I first started speaking, there was a lot of talk about Ukraine pushing Russia out. I've not heard any conversation from Ukrainian officials, colleagues, friends, or the military that is an ambition anymore. It's more about bringing this brutal war to an end. And I suspect, therefore, the focus is less on clearing Ukraine territory in the near term from Russian soldiers and more about increasing the pain so that President Putin eventually has to sue for peace.
Let's also cover recent publication by Reuters about the real Putin's intentions. As Reuters reports, Putin intends to keep fighting in Ukraine until the West engages on his terms for peace, and also Putin believes that Russia's economy and his military are strong enough to weather any additional Western sanctions, according to Reuters sources. What is your reaction to this?
I think what Russia has been very effective at is demonstrating that it is strong enough to just continue, and there's not a lot the West can do. It's threatened the West with nuclear weapons if it threatens to get involved. And I think I've said to you before that if I was a military advisor to President Putin, the one thing that Russia would have to avoid is the West getting directly involved in the war, because the might of NATO is an order of magnitude bigger than Russia's military capability. Russia is already struggling fighting against Ukraine. Imagine how it would bear if it was to fight against NATO or America. It wouldn't stand a chance. So as a result, President Putin is always full of bluster to try to keep the West out of this conflict. But the brutal reality is that he's running out of people, he's running out of military equipment, he's got his economy on a war footing, which is consuming money very fast, and the only way to fund that is the sale of oil and gas. And therefore, if you can turn that revenue off, and there are ways to do that, then it will make life increasingly difficult for Russia. And the prevailing view of most of my military colleagues is history suggests that you can negotiate all you like with President Putin, but it's not going to get you anywhere. You have to force Putin to stop. And as I say, that's either militarily or economically. And I suspect before the West gets involved in a military fight, it's going to want to test the full spectrum of economic measures that it can take. And there are a few pretty significant ones that could force Putin's hand.
You just mentioned also about the economic measures of pressure. However, even US President Donald Trump is not sure whether his sanctions against Russia could work with Putin and could force him to end the war. What does this mean? And don't you think that this could be an indication of a sort of weakness from the US?
I think you're right, but let's be quite clear, Daniel. If any of your colleagues could tell what President Trump's actually thinking and what he's actually going to do, then you're much smarter than I am. President Trump seems to decide in his own time what he's going to do. He doesn't like being taken for a fool. He doesn't like feeling like an idiot. And therefore, if President Putin, he's been given the chance to stop the war, Putin has not taken that. And therefore, it'll be interesting to see what President Trump does next. He will not want history to remember him as a president who had the tools available to stop the war, but didn't use them. I think the challenge, though, and it is worth just elaborating slightly, that I've heard some people talk about these tariffs, impose 100% tariff on anybody buying Russian oil. It's not quite that simple because the biggest consumer of Russian oil is China. So the one thing you would do is massively harm relations with China and also India. Now, that's not something particularly that the American president might feel he wants to do. So there are implications for these tariffs, and it wouldn't have an immediate effect. Russia has enough backlog of oil and gas and enough savings to continue the war for the rest of this season. The challenge, though, is ultimately, does President Trump want to stop this, and will he bring the might of the American economy to bear? Because that's probably going to be the best way of doing it.